Hello, you're very welcome to this month's episode of the LGBTQI plus Heritage History Club. The Heritage Project is in conjunction with Here and I, the Rainbow Project in Carfriend, and very kindly funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. This evening we have the return of Michael Friars. Michael is a long-time supporter of the project and has, including having volunteered with us for a number of years, and is now working in the War Museum in Talbot Street in Belfast. Michael, would you like to give a wee presentation and give a wee introduction?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary Ellen. It's lovely to be back with the Heritage Project after a while, and thanks for the invitation to present this evening. So, as Mary Ellen said, my name's Michael Fryer. I work for the Northern Ireland War Memorial, which is a Second World War museum in Belfast. And I actually gave a version of this presentation about 5 years ago now. It was for the LGBTQIA plus health and well-being fair, which was held in the summer of 2020. And I thought it would be nice maybe to try to revisit this and include maybe a bit more up-to-date information about different programs, museums, events. But fundamentally, it's the same idea, which is about how LGBTQIA plus heritage can really benefit our well-being and the connections between those two subjects. So hopefully you'll find this interesting and be very glad to have a discussion afterwards or to take any comments or questions you might have. Just to give you a little bit of a personal background, I started off at my previous presentation and I started off again with Roger Casement, whom I'm sure you'll all be aware was an Irish nationalist leader, somebody who spent a lot of time actually in Belfast, although he was originally born in Dublin, brought up in North Antrim, eventually became a British diplomat, and then, as we know, became involved in nationalism, and was eventually executed in 1916. But when I was growing up in North Belfast as a teenager, I think I was very conscious, with it being the late 1990s, that it was very difficult, I felt at the time, to find anything in the way of local LGBTQIA plus heritage. And then I came across a book by Jeffrey Dudgeon, which was called The Black Diaries, which is actually Jeff Dudgeon, who is in his own right a well-known gay rights campaigner, but who's also an historian and created this book looking at the diaries that Roger Casement kept and which outlined really his life as a gay man in the early 20th century. And I found out through this book that Roger Casement used to stay when he was in Belfast at 105 Antrim Road, which Mary Ellen will know all about. He stayed there with a landlady, and he also stayed with Francis Joseph Bigger, who was a local antiquarian. He lived further on up the Antrim Road near Madigan. And for me, I felt that was a really important way for me as a young gay man, who was, I suppose, exploring his identity as a gay man and was looking for those connections as somebody who loved history from very early on, was looking for those connections with LGBTQIA plus figures. That was very important to know that Roger Casement had that connection with North Belfast, and as one of our most famous gay figures from Irish history, had that local connection, lived just down the road from where I was living and where actually my ancestors had been living at exactly the same time that he was staying there. And Casement continues to be a figure that I'm fascinated by in terms of our local history. Um, I want to talk a bit about what is well-being. There's an organization called the New Economics Foundation, and it defines well-being as this: the concept of well-being comprises two main elements, feeling good and functioning well. What does feeling good mean? Well, it means emotions such as happiness, contentment, enjoyment, curiosity, and engagement. Functioning well means experiencing positive relationships, having some control over our lives, and having a sense of purpose. And it was this organization, the New Economics Foundation, that in 2008 produced a report called The 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And really, what they were trying to do was they were aiming to come up with a set of evidence-based actions to improve personal well-being. So they didn't want to have just something that was ethereal or didn't have any grounding in reality. They wanted to actually have these very concrete steps, if you like, that you could take that have been shown to have a positive impact on well-being. So those 5 ways are connect. So I suppose being connected with your local community, personal relationships, having those connections with people around you, being active, which I think speaks for itself, taking notice, so being very much aware of what's around you and what you're feeling, um, and savoring the moment. Keep learning, trying something new, maybe setting yourself a challenge, and even what you were saying, Amy, about learning to crochet. Maybe that's one way you could keep learning. It's definitely not something I've done, but maybe I will eventually. And give, which a lot of us understand about looking outside ourselves and being able to give back to others and to the wider community. And as I say, these are actually evidence-based, and they have been used by a number of different organizations, particularly health organizations, as a framework when planning, defining, and measuring their well-being work. So, for example, Belfast Strategic Partnership, through its mental health and emotional well-being thematic group, created a toolkit based on the 5 ways to well-being approach. And to say, it is very evidence-based, and that is why it has been very popular over the past few years. Um, I don't think I need to remind any of us that when it comes to LGBTQIA plus well-being in Northern Ireland, there is a lot of research that's been done over, say, the past 10 years or so into that. And I've just outlined some of these here. Even going back to 2013, when Mal O'Hara produced a report for the Rainbow Project, Through Our Minds, exploring the emotional health and well-being of LGBT people in Northern Ireland. I think it's pretty well established now that there are definitely higher rates of mental ill health amongst the LGBTQIA plus population compared with other parts of our population. Um, there are other reports mentioned there. 2014, a public agency report into the lives of older LGBT people, which showed that almost 4 out of 5 respondents believed healthcare professional needed more awareness of LGBT needs, and 1 in 4 did not know someone who could or would care for them if they required it. And then more recently, in 2021, a report was produced by an organization called Just Like Us, which showed that LGBTQIA plus people young people in Northern Ireland are 3 times more likely to contemplate suicide compared with their non-LGBTQIA plus counterparts. And that is true here in Northern Ireland as well, compared with other parts of the population. So I think it's fair to say that there are particular challenges for the LGBTQIA plus community here in Northern Ireland compared to other places, and compared with other parts of our society here. And so there's all the more need, I suppose, to emphasize the importance of mental health and the importance of positive well-being for our community. Um, I think as well, we're still we're 5 years on now from the start of COVID this month. But it is well shown now that the effects of COVID are long term. We're still feeling those, and the pandemic had a particular impact on the LGBTQIA plus population. For example, this was from The Guardian 5 years ago, the Quarantine study, which looked at the impact of the pandemic on the community. You can see some of the statistics there. 69% of respondents suffered depressive symptoms. 90% of those were experiencing homophobia or transphobia. Almost 10% of people felt unsafe in their own homes. 1/6 of respondents said they'd experienced discrimination during the pandemic, and higher levels of stress and depressive symptoms for transgender and gender diverse respondents. And I would say that's even more so given the political context over recent years and the particular difficulties that people within the trans and gender fluid community have been experiencing. I think it's fair to say there's been particular challenges there. Um, so just to go back to my own work in the Northern Ireland War Memorial, um, I suppose this is where I first started getting interested in the connections between um, well-being and uh, heritage and museum work. And this was a project that I did back in 2018 called Live Well, which was in partnership with National Museums Northern Ireland. It was actually funded by the National Lottery Community Fund, and it was looking at working with particularly older people, people who maybe are from more disadvantaged backgrounds, people who may be experiencing social isolation, for example, and connecting them with heritage. And so I was able to work with a community group. I was actually a day centre in North Belfast, going in there over a number of weeks and bringing objects from our collection at the museum and doing crafts and activities relating to the Second World War. So this is a decoupage activity we did based around the poppy, which, as we know, is a symbol of remembrance. And as you can see, one lady, she decorated her book and wrote in it the name of a relative who was actually killed in the Belfast Blitz. So for me, that was really interesting just to be able to see the emotional impact that had on people and to be able to use those 5 ways to well-being, and think of ways in which I, as a museum heritage professional, can actually um, connect with those people and help improve their well-being. And we do a number of different activities in the museum. On the right, we run singing workshops with a music therapist called Karen Diamond. We work with people living with dementia because it has been shown through research that singing is really good for people living with dementia. It's based on the Alzheimer's Society program from a number of years ago called Singing for the Brain. And even if you are not living with dementia, singing has been shown to be good for you. It has real benefits for your well-being and your mood. And on the left, we have a reminiscence box. And again, reminiscence is really good, particularly for older people. It's good for people to connect with their memories and stories of the war, and even just to be able to, I suppose, reconnect with their earlier life. And again, that's particularly true for people who may be living with dementia. And even in terms of LGBTQIA plus history, over recent years, we've been able to mark LGBT plus History Month every February. And we started doing tours of the museum based around that history. And this was our inaugural LGBT plus History Month tour, which was, I think it was back in February 2023. So it was really good to be able to do that for the first time. And some of the faces in that photograph you might recognize, Mary Ellen. So we've been able to do that every month now since then, or every February since then. And we've run some of these as well for Belfast Pride every July. Um, and even just talking about heritage and well-being generally, um, it is pretty well established now, just in terms of the connections between heritage and well-being. So, for example, this is a report from 2019, Heritage and Wellbeing, What Works Centre for Wellbeing, where it talks about some of the connections that can be made between heritage and well-being. So, for example, they point out some of the benefits you can get from heritage-based cultural activities in museums, object handling, like the kind I was talking about in hospitals and healthcare settings, being able to visit historic houses and museums, inclusion projects, social engagement, volunteering, which you'll know about with this project, of course, community heritage research, and all the benefits which come from that, which include confidence, a sense of empowerment, social connectivity, life satisfaction and happiness, skills and learning, sense of well-being, and sense of belonging. So all well-established benefits from engaging with heritage. So I just want to outline now just some examples of projects that have been shown to have a real impact on people's well-being and are kind of, I suppose, sort of standout projects and initiatives from recent years in terms of LGBTQ plus Heritage. This is one back in 2017 called Prejudice and Pride, which was established by the National Trust. It was a big campaign across the National Trust, where I suppose what they were trying to do was to look at a number of their historic properties and really dig down deep into outlining and highlighting the LGBTQIA plus connections that could be made. I actually have a copy. This is a fantastic book called Prejudice and Pride. You can see the picture there of the front cover on the screen, and I'm holding it up here as well. On the front cover is a man called the Marquis of Anglesey, who, as you can see, was pretty gay, it has to be said. Like dressing up a lot, and spent a fortune, I think, on dressing up and putting on theatrical pageants, and died quite young, but definitely made a big impact. Not the sort of normal looking Victorian aristocrat that you might expect to see, but again, he was part of that project, and the National Trust spent some time telling the story of his life. One of the kind of sadder projects was at a property called Kingston Lacy, which is in Dorset, and it was owned by a man called William John Banks, who lived, he was an MP actually. He lived in the house in the early 19th century, collected a lot of objects from Europe and also from Egypt. There's actually an obelisk at the house, which he transported from Egypt and erected in the grounds of the estate. But he was caught with a guardsman, and he was a gay man and had to flee abroad, and very sadly was never ever able to return home. I think there was a story that he might have been able to come back in disguise at one point, but he never was able to return to England because of the threat of being prosecuted. And he eventually died in exile. When he was living abroad, he still sent objects back to the house, but he never had the opportunity to see them in place. And what they decided to do, the National Trust, was they created a project called Exile, which was inspired by William John Banks' life. It featured 3 distinct installations linked by a series of new interpretive panels. As visitors entered the house, they encountered in memoriam, which you can see the picture of. It was a tribute to the 51 men who were hanged under laws that criminalised same-sex acts in England during William John Banks' lifetime. And it was a reminder of the brutality of those times and the context of his actions. And one of the really poignant things about it is I think the ropes are all different lengths, representing the ages of some of these men who were hanged. Some were very, very young teenagers. Some were, men, quite old men. Further into the house, there's a second installation called Displaced, which used projection and sound to make connections between Banks' story and the ongoing persecution of LGBTQI plus people, drawing on contemporary experiences of those who've been forced to leave their homes in the UK and abroad. And the final installation, Prejudice, Persecution and Pride, set Banks' story within a global history that examined how the law has shaped and continues to shape LGBTQIA plus lives. They included facsimile copies of legal documents from the Parliamentary Archives, alongside a timeline that reveals familiar and surprising stories of persecution and intolerance, liberation and equality. And there was a very positive response, an overwhelmingly positive response. A lot of people were very moved and personally impacted. And just to share some of the quotes from the exhibition, some of the audience responses, LGBT people have always been here. Everyone is different and we need to accept that. This exhibition is needed more now than ever. Even though the law has been changed, there's still homophobia that needs to be challenged. I think it's important for the National Trust to represent the whole nation in its differences. So although there was a certain amount of controversy around that whole programme of Prejudice and Pride, and certain right-wing newspapers, shall we say, made a big deal about some of the initiatives, I think it's fair to say it was something the National Trust can be proud of, and it made a really positive impact on those who went to places like Kingston Lacy and saw some of these initiatives and these exhibitions. There's also been a really interesting community museum developed called the Museum of Transology, which was actually started as a mobile museum back in 2014, and it collects and exhibits trans, non-binary, and intersex people's everyday objects that they've donated. It's curated by E.J. Scott, whom you can see on the left, who's a transgender man, and he got the idea from all the medical related objects that he'd saved up from his own transition surgery. So he started collecting in 2014, and these objects first went on display at the London College of Fashion in 2017, and it represented a desire for trans people for authentic representation. People could donate any object they chose, and they were asked to fill out a travel tag describing the object and its significance to their gender journey. So you can see this is lipstick on the right, and it says, "This lipstick was from my wonderful sister, who was the first family member to accept and support my transition." Um, and E.J. Scott says this: "What is extraordinary about these everyday objects is the way in which they share themes of not only despair, but of hope, of ambition, achievement, self-confidence, and success. Real voices, real things, real people. They are emotionally charged, personal, and heartwarming." It actually started in Brighton, which supposedly has the largest trans, non-binary, and intersex population. It was in Brighton Museum and Art Gallery for 3 years, and it now has over 280 objects. It's now part of the Bishopsgate Institute, was a cultural institute, a cultural venue in London. And I believe that they still travel and have mobile exhibitions. But it's a real example of a museum that started as a very much as from community collecting workshops, and it's grown from there. And I just think it's a really interesting and dynamic approach to what a museum should be. Also, I suppose there's a more recent museum called the Queer Britain Museum. This is the first LGBTQIA, the first dedicated museum for LGBTQIA plus people in the UK, and it was opened at King's Cross in London in 2022. I've just pulled this from their website, but they have had a number of objects donated, a number of temporary exhibitions. They actually have at the minute a film being shown, which is a documentary about Brodsky Beat, the band from the 1980s. And they actually won Best Small Museum Project with the Museums Association back in 2022. So again, that's really exciting. It's still early days, but it's fantastic to see a dedicated permanent museum for LGBTQIA plus history based in London. And I think it's going to continue to develop, and I hope to visit it myself whenever I'm next over in London. Then if we move to Dublin, the National Museum of Ireland has done a number of LGBTQIA plus programs and exhibitions and projects over recent years. Back in 2020, they ran an exhibition called Rainbow Revolution, which highlighted noteworthy members of the LGBTQIA plus community from early mythology to current day, and they included oral histories gathered from members of the LGBTQIA plus community in Ireland. So they included, for example, Patty Bliss's dress, which she wore when she delivered her famous Noble Call speech in the Abbey Theatre in 2014. And it was about homophobia in Ireland, that speech, and it helped to start the national conversation on same-sex marriage ahead of the marriage equality referendum in 2015. They included the wedding dresses of Minister for Children and Youth Affairs Catherine Zapponi and her wife Anne Louise Gilligan, which was worn at their wedding ceremony at Dublin Castle in 2016, 8 months after the Dublin Castle had been the site of large celebrations when Ireland became the first country to legalise same-sex marriage by popular vote. And very poignantly, Gilligan died the following year. They also were collecting new oral histories, and a new Rainbow Revolution trail was available to the public too. And as you can see, they had a really pithy but really, I think, effective poster: Panty's dress, Casement's coat, Connor's flag, Joni's voice. And I know that had a big impact when it was first exhibited in 2020. And I'm not sure in terms of up to date how much the National Museum is still doing in terms of LGBTQIA plus programming, but I would say that definitely has started a conversation within the museum, and I'm sure they've been doing more since then. And then more locally, national museums in Northern Ireland on the right, you can see a poster for a photographic exhibition that they put on in 2017, which was developed in partnership with Rachel Wallace, who was a PhD candidate from Queen's University, based on photographs of Doug Sobey, well-known local gay rights campaigner. He helped to found Car Friend in 1974 and remained an officer there for 30 years. Doug's collection of photographs, which he has actually donated to the Ulster Museum, documented the experiences of the LGBTQIA plus community during the 1970s, the campaign for legal rights, and the development of organizations like Car Friend. They also capture important social events and the resilience of the LGBTQIA plus community at that time. And actually, I think it's really important as well that if you look on the left, there's a T-shirt from the first Gay Pride in 1991 in Belfast, and that, as I understand it, has been part of the Troubles and Beyond exhibition, which is the permanent exhibition in the Modern History Galleries at the Ulster Museum. And there's very much a sense in which that exhibition, as much as it's been telling the history of the Troubles, because it's called the Troubles and Beyond, it's also been about telling that wider social history of Northern Ireland during that time. And that includes, of course, the campaign for LGBTQIA plus rights. And I know national museums have been very interested in continuing that work. There was also the Outing the Past International Festival of LGBT plus history. And back in 2020, the Museum of Free Dairy actually had a temporary exhibition called Queering the North. It was the first ever museum exhibition dedicated to an expansive reading of the history of the LGBTQIA plus community in the north of Ireland from 1967 to the present day. Included the timeline of key events, starting with the exclusion of Northern Ireland from the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which only covered in England and Wales, and ending with the change in the marriage equality laws, which recognise marriage equality from January 2020. Yeah, so there's been a lot happening in recent years in the North, and even just more up to date. Some of you might have been to see this exhibition, which was at the Ulster Museum and then moved to the Public Record Office and only finished last month. And this was a temporary exhibition, which was a mock-up of a shed which belonged to a man called David Strain. And David Strain was a local gay man. He lived in Belfast and kept a diary from the 1920s through to the 1940s, and then again in the 1960s before he died in the late 1960s. And Tom Hume, who is a well-known local historian and has done a lot of work documenting our local LGBTQIA plus history. He was working with Leanne McCormick. So Tom's from Queen's University, Leanne McCormick's an academic with Ulster University, and they both were working on these diaries, and they were kept in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, but until relatively recently, they were not publicised, and especially through the work that Tom and Leanne have done, including having them used as the basis for a BBC radio drama last year. They've been able to tell David Strain's story in his own words, and this exhibition was included as part of that. So it included items relating, for example, to Oscar Wilde, who was a favorite author of David Strain, and references to his favorite music. This was kind of his refuge. It was somewhere he went. It was out towards Saintfield in County Down. He lived in South Belfast, and this was kind of his solace and his refuge as a gay man who couldn't be out in the 1930s. And Tom actually did a talk at the Public Record Office in partnership with ourselves at the Northern Ireland War Memorial about David Strain's life. Fascinating individual, and the diaries themselves, I think there's going to be a lot more work done on making sure that those are made as accessible as possible. They're fascinating insight into the life of a gay man in Belfast in the early part of the 20th century. Some of you as well might have been to Hillsborough Castle in County Down. And again, over recent years, they've been running LGBTQIA plus tours of the castle. They were developed by Chris Reid, who was a former PhD researcher at Ulster University looking into queer history particularly in museums and heritage sites. And Chris developed these tours with the idea that he would work with local LGBTQIA plus groups, giving them the opportunity to influence how this tour would look. And I think he would say that the majority of the feedback is very positive. Chris no longer works at Hillsborough Castle, but they are continuing to run them. So one man, for example, who took part in these tours said he'd never thought he'd see something like this in Northern Ireland and got quite emotional, supposedly talking about it. And another lady in the feedback said it made Hillsborough Castle feel like a really safe place for her. And I think there's a sense in which, like the National Trust's Places of Pride project, this is something that's taking somewhere that's, I suppose, traditionally been seen as somewhere quite conservative, somewhere that's very traditional and has a very traditional view of history, and bringing alive those LGBTQIA plus stories and taking a different perspective on somewhere well long and fascinating uh, history. And then I thought I'd just finish just going back to, as Mary Ellen mentioned, I was a volunteer from 2020 from the very start of the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project. Mary Ellen, I will leave it to you to talk about maybe more recent initiatives, but a lot of this, I think it's fair to say, has built on this early sort of period of the project when it was launched at the Ulster Museum back in 2020. Richard O'Leary was the project coordinator at the time. But it's a remarkable reminder that when the project started, basically when COVID started in spring of 2020, we all had to meet online. You can actually see a photograph of us 5 years ago, not like we've aged or anything. But we were all in lockdown at the time. And as I've shown, the research shows that lockdown had a particularly negative impact on LGBTQIA plus people. And I know for me personally, I find it such a godsend to be able to have a project like this, which I could connect with, where I could, even if it wasn't Zoom and I wasn't meeting any of these people personally, to be able to have something outside my work, outside my daily life, to be able to connect with. And these were just a few quotes that I got from the time about the impact that the project had on those first volunteers, about how important it was to be able to feel connected to a network of people during a time of isolation, that sense of collective effort, being able to connect with the wider LGBT community in Belfast. Um, that word connection keeps coming up in those comments, and the ability to be able to look beyond ourselves at such a challenging time. And there was some feedback as well about well-being, and again, it just shows just how many of those 5 ways to well-being our volunteers felt they were able to connect with through the project. And I know, Mary Ellen, you still are very much collecting feedback from people who take part in programs as part of the project, but this is just one piece of feedback from somebody who was at an early history club event. I find it incredibly affirming that sexual history and queerness does not just start with Stonewall. I know that sounds odd, but it just makes me feel a lot more at peace with myself. Um, so let me finish then with some top tips about how can you connect with well-being and LGBTQIA plus heritage. These are all based on the 5 ways to well-being. I definitely recommend those as sort of guidelines, if you like, for how you would want to improve your all well-being or keep positively impacting on it. So I think that idea of connection, which comes through with those comments I've just shared, we all are people of relationships. We all want to be able to connect with our community, and I think that's something really important included as that about talking to older LGBTQIA plus people about their memories and their stories. I know in my work at the Northern Ireland War Memorial, we're always very keen to talk to older people who have memories and stories of the Second World War. And Mary Ellen can maybe comment when we're finished about, I know there's been emphasis in terms of the project so far in maybe training to do oral history and being able to record those those stories and those experiences of older LGBTQIA plus people in the community. Being active, I know walking tours are something that's been part of this project over a number of years now. And even podcasts, I know the project now runs these podcasts. So there's nothing better, I find, than being able to go for a walk and listening to a podcast as well. Take notice. I pointed out some of the museums and some of the recent exhibitions that are around. Look for those connections with local history because they are out there and they're coming to the fore all the more. Keep learning. There are plenty of books out there, heritage events. Do your own research as well. I pointed out the David Strain diaries. That was something that Tom Hume and Leanne McCormick came across through their own research in the Public Record Office. And, that's been a really rich repository of an insight into LGBTQIA plus history, as I said, and give. I know this project again has been able to collect stories and potentially artifacts as well, relating to our LGBTQIA plus past and volunteering as well. I don't think there's anything better than volunteering in terms of being able to give your own skills and your own time to be able to do something like this. So I'm going to stop sharing there, but I want to thank you for your attention this evening, and I hope it's been interesting and it's been maybe insightful and given you a bit of food for thought. I'm happy to have a bit of a discussion, or if you want to ask any questions, by all means. But thank you very much, otherwise, for having me.
Michael, I'm just going to come in. Some of the things that we're doing at the moment, one of the things I think I kind of think is a wee bit different than what stuff we've done in the
Yeah,
past, is we had went and showed the documentary out at the Linen Hill Museum out in Lisburn.
yeah.
So uh we like to call it an audio display or
Mm-hmm.
audio exhibition. So it is some clips from podcasts, some clips that people have given us through kind of LGBT History Club
Yeah,
uh, interviews. So we have those kind of QR codes and people's pictures, and we're bringing that out there for a month-long exhibition.
brilliant.
We're going to bring some of our other artifacts out with us, for instance, like some of the badges we'll have, some of the
Mm-hmm.
leaflets we'll have. And I've actually just wrote down my note and we note to myself when I seen your memory box. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, oh, that would be a lovely way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and I have actually wrote, see if I can borrow an old LP um record player from someone. You know, I
Mm.
used to be able to open
Oh yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. Like a gramophone.
yeah, that type of thing. I thought that
Yeah.
would be but we're doing that. We're going to do a series of workshops with them over the space of the 4 weeks. So that's something new for us to kind of go out into Lisburn. I think it's really important. And I know that Lisburn technically is now a city, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but out in Lisburn, you still have more access to people who come from a rural background than you
Yeah, yeah,
probably.
yeah. No, definitely.
The oral history, we're capturing that through the podcasts. And we're always asking people, whatever you have, please give us it because you know, for me it's the kind of lived history is the most important thing.
Yeah,
Like
definitely.
I love getting badges.
Yeah.
Badges say so much about a person's identity because you're literally wearing your identity on your
Mhm.
sleeve
Yeah.
or on your jacket or whatever. And I think it's, you know, for me that's a really lovely piece of artifact we can have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to take a photo of those because we
Mm-hmm.
don't always need the physical object. You know,
Yeah.
we'll would love just digital copies. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it is for that. It's for all of our stuff is free,
Mm-hmm.
accessible for other people, and we don't mind sharing.
Yeah, which is great. And I think those objects, it's like that Museum of Transology, for example. Those are really powerful, those personal objects, because they all have a story. And whether it is a little badge, as you're describing, that has a whole story behind it that represents something really important potentially in somebody's life.
We actually done an event with Queer Space, and I know that the one of the people with their cameras off was at it, and I had 5 volunteers with me, and I got each of them to talk about an object that reflected their own personal history.
Mm-hmm.
One of the volunteers, who is a young trans man, it was a white shirt, and he wore his white shirt down.
Mm-hmm.
It was literally before he had his top surgery. He couldn't have worn a white shirt.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's someone else, it was a bi flag, and he had carried this at the first ever parade he'd been at, and it meant an awful lot to him. Megan's was badges. So it was all of those everyday objects. Garth was a sticker. And I think, what did I bring down? Did I bring down a teddy? I think I may have brought down a teddy, um, which was representing an award I won a number of years back. But these were things that we were kind of showing our everyday objects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fun, such a conversation that people started talking about P.A. McLaughlin, you
Mm-hmm.
know, one icon of our LGBTQ heritage. Um, and even like, people were talking about that they actually had photos of the just after PA passed away, I think it was Queer Space actually all borrowed those mobility scooters and dressed
Mm-hmm.
up as PA did, and kind of went in on like a V, almost like the kind of fly past the people on.
Yeah.
At Belfast Pride led, I think they may have led Belfast Pride that year. Um, when people, so it kind of like, for me, the beauty too of our history is it spins those stories. It brings people back
Mm.
times to a happier place, and unfortunately sometimes to a more negative time
Yeah.
of things. And I think too that when I'd spoken to you earlier at the very start of this evening, and I says, well, your first presentation that we had shown it to our funders,
Mm.
and the amazing thing was that because of that, they give us the money to be able to have, like, if you're attending one of our events, if you're one of our volunteers and you're feeling a wee bit under pressure, a wee bit triggered, or just you need someone to talk to, we can do that. We can refer you to say, like, talking therapies or to a counselor. And that became from the origins of this talk.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And no, I mean, as we said, there are so many challenges for the community when it comes to mental health and well-being. So to be able to do a project like this, which is that source of people taking pride in their identity and their history, that's really empowering, isn't it?
Yes, for me, that's what it's all about.
Hmm.
Anybody have any other comments or questions? Or would you like to put them in the chat and I'll read them out?
Sorry, I was just taking my dressing gown off. Um, thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. Um, I thought sort of the things you were talking about, how museums are having sort of exhibitions,
Mm.
focusing on sort of queer themes is really interesting. And I was thinking, what was the festival that Prony has historically done? It's called outing
That the
something.
Iding the Past, yeah, Iding the
Yes,
Past.
I just wondered, was that on at the minute, or what's going on with
I'm
that with
I'm not
that?
sure. I think that's where that original Queering the North exhibition came from. That was in partnership with Iding the Past. It was around this time every year. Uh,
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
It's
you
usually the
know,
start of April. Now, last year was a bit later. And I have a
mm,
feeling it's usually Adam Murray from Carfred that takes the lead here uh,
Yeah.
in Belfast. Each of the ones we have taken part in over the last 5 years. But I haven't heard anything this year. I know
Mm.
last year he was talking about possibly moving it to September and doing a bigger symposium. Um, but I haven't heard anything. I will find out and let you know.
Yeah. It was always really good and really interesting, unusual things happening at it.
Hmm.
Because I remember the last time I was at it was 5 years ago in
Wow.
Promey just before the
Hmm.
lockdown.
Hmm.
And this woman had published a book about two lesbian performers and sort of like the vaudeville acts, and they performed a song together. It was amazing. It was so cool.
Brilliant. Mm.
Yeah, and then I remember reading about the book off the sort of back of that, and that was my like lockdown reading. So yeah, it was where I might get it out and reread it. So it was just so interesting. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but
No, no, no. I didn't mention either, but I don't know how much of this is connected. There have been so many prides have developed over the past 5 years, and I feel like in some ways, I don't know how much there's a connection between all these exhibitions, all these programs, which there's been a real flowering of LGBTQI plus heritage over the past 5 years or so in Northern Ireland, including this project, obviously, and then all these different prides popping up as
Yeah.
well. And I wonder how much there's a connection between the two.
I know that we're down Mid-East Antrim in which are having theirs in Ballymena. We were at the first ever openly LGBTQI plus event last year in I think possibly September. Down in Ballymena in the Braid Centre, and the Mid-East Antrim Pride seems to have come out of that event. But we're down to do an event with them at their first Pride. I
Hmm.
think we're down to show our new documentary, which I sincerely hope is finished in time. I know it will be. Um, but we're down to show the documentary with them the night before their first Pride.
Great.
in Ballymena.
Ballymena, which is
So
lovely because at Causeway Pride, we went down the night before the first Causeway Pride and showed the troubles I've seen. And we were also to do that in Fermanagh, but they changed their mind. But I mean, like even Lurgan has Pride now, and I just think it's amazing.
when's the Ballymena one? And I'll make a point of coming to
So
that.
off the top of my head, I want to say the 29th of June.
Right,
Um,
okay. I'll make a point of coming to that.
I'm really glad you're saying that, Amy. I had you down to chart. I wasn't just telling you yet, but I had you down as a
There you go.
possible juror.
It's the 28th of June,
Yeah,
Saturday, the
there you go.
28th of June.
Yeah, so there's the list of all the
Okay.
prides this year. I have them on the phone. So we'll have Oma on the 14th, Mid-East Antrim on the 28th, Belfast the 26th of July, Causeway the 2nd of August, Lurgan the 16th of August, Foyle the 23rd of August, Newry the 30th of August, Fermanagh the 6th of September, and Trans Pride the 13th of September. Now, they don't have Lurgan Pride on that yet, but it's also this year, so yeah.
It's quite interesting, Michael, what you were saying about Roger Casement.
Hmm.
Um, because obviously he lived in Ballymena at a point in Galgorm Castle, so that just seems quite interesting.
Yeah, I think he went to Ballymena Academy as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I,
I find him fascinating because
on
he's
our
what was
on
that,
our
Mary?
on our online archive, we have some footage from his schooling days. Well,
Oh, right, okay.
from his schooling.
Um, I think he's very interesting because he's there's such a complex identity there as somebody who was a British diplomat knighted for his humanitarian work in the Congo and the Putumayo in South America, and Irish nationalist, an Ulsterman and an Irish nationalist, and all these different identities, and a gay man, who, and then obviously there's the diaries and the controversy around that. I think as well, going back to David Strain and those diaries I mentioned in the Public Record Office, diaries are really fascinating. I'm really fascinated by them. Maybe because I'm just nosy, but also, they do represent, and you'll know this, Amy, as a writer, there's something about that space of being able to reveal your deepest self when you keep a diary, but maybe with an eye to thinking maybe one day somebody will read this as well. But I think they're always really interesting as repositories of people's identity.
Yeah.
I used to spend hours in the special collections in Queens reading the diaries of Somerville and Ross, the Anglo-Irish writers who the scholars aren't sure if they were lesbians or not, but they seem to have this very, very close relationship. And when one of them died, the other one communicated with her via automatic writing. And even though one of them was dead, they published books with both of their names because they said it was still a joint effort, even though one of them was deceased. But I used to spend hours reading their sort of personal diaries, and it was amazing.
Very
So
interesting.
interesting. But then I asked the librarian if she could sort of do some research to see if, well, not like proof, but to see if there's anything lesbian in it. And then the librarian was like, sorry, I couldn't find anything. But then I sort of felt like maybe we had different ideas about what we were like looking for. Do you know what I mean? And then that whole question of proof came up. Which is, sorry, I'm going off on another tangent. But
I know what you mean.
yeah, so yeah, I like reading those sort of diaries and things like that as well.
I know I kind of think that, you know, if I think back to being a teenager, I did keep a diary when I was a teenager, but then I kind of got rid of them. And I always regret doing that.
You got rid of them?
Yeah. And I really I went to America as a teenager, and it was an amazing time. And I had wrote every single day, like pages about my activities, what I thought of the place, you know, about my family, missing them and all of that. And so when I came back, I was in the habit of writing, and I kept that up for about a year and a half. And then moving house and all of that there. I one time I thought, you know, I'll just get rid of these, and I just really want to go back and kick the bejesus out of myself for doing that.
Yeah.
You'll just have to start again, Mary Ellen.
Life's not as interesting now, Michael.
Life's always interesting.
But listen, I'm going to stop the recording, so I'm going to stop by saying thank you very much. Thank you it was really interesting, and thank you to everybody else for attending. I will be sending out evaluations, so expect a wee email from me. So I'm going to say good night to the recording now, and just stop it. Is that okay, Michael? Do you have anything?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.